Welcome back, everyone. I have returned. One of the most famous quotes from World War II history, maybe in all of history, but long before October 20th, 1944, when MacArthur uttered those words, there were many who had returned to lead the fight against the Japanese occupying forces. This session is about those brave soldiers. It features Marie Vallejo. Marie had a very successful corporate career and then got into history. She has served on the board of the American Historical Collection in Manila, and she spearheaded the scanning of the guerrilla recognition program files at the U.S. National Archives. She is also the author of The Battle of Ising, regarding the battle and liberation of Mindanao, and the book we're going to hear on today, Dauntless, the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiments of the United States Army. Interviewing Marie will be James Scott. James, who wrote the masterful book Rampage on the Battle of Manila, leads our tours to the Philippines and is probably the most or second most popular American to return to the Philippines behind MacArthur. His latest book, though not on World War II, just came out. It's a bestseller, co-authored with Jack Carr, Targeted Beirut, about the 1983 Marine barracks bombings. So after you read all of your books you bought this weekend, go out and buy that one. Ladies and gentlemen, Marie Vallejo and James Scott.
Hear me? Okay, there we go. Good morning.
Hello. Yeah, okay.
Thank you guys for being here this weekend. Thank you, Marie, for joining me here on stage today. As Jeremy noted, I have returned. It's without a doubt the most famous promise of World War II, right? Douglas MacArthur utters that in March of 1942 when he escapes from the Philippines and arrives in Australia. It would be 32 months before he returned in October of 1944 to redeem that pledge. And Marie has written a masterful book, Dauntless. It's on sale outside. I would highly encourage you all to go grab it. That covers that pivotal time period and what happened in the Philippines during those 32 months. And it's a story that, quite frankly, not enough people know. And so we're really excited that Marie is joining us here in New Orleans to talk about her book, talk about her research, and of course, talk about her personal connection to this story as well. It's on the 1st and the 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiments, which were sent in secretively to fight and help out with the guerrillas. But before we get into that, Marie, if we could, let's back up a little bit and talk about sort of America's history pre-war in the Philippines and sort of the connection that the United States and the Philippines shared before the outbreak of World War II.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here in the museum, and James for the dialogue. And before I also start, I know that there's a lot of you probably who don't like General MacArthur, that he thinks he's a pompous ass and narcissistic. I get that all the time when I'm giving the talk. So, but I'm here to talk about what he did in the Philippines on his way to Japan. And please don't shoot the messenger, okay? Most of the Filipinos like him because of what he did. Okay. So one thing I think that people forget is that the Philippines was a colony of the U.S. Okay, so you had the war with Spain, 1898, which just lasted a year, an hour on the Manila Bay to save face, I think, for the Spanish Armada. Then you had the Filipino-American War for 4 years in the Philippines. Now, that was really, there was a lot of atrocities there, too. But that was at that time. You know, there was a period at that time when in subjugation, pretty much, under benevolent assimilation of the U.S. And then after that, there was peacetime, and the people responded positively to it because the U.S. had, they established hospitals, public education, a lot of the American ways, cars and cars and clothes and everything, they were all followed, you know, the Western American way. They liked the hospitals, the medicines that they were afforded, and there was respect, you know, for the people. They were not, you know, with the atrocities of during the Philippine-American War. Now, that's another story. Somebody should do a real good research on it. Then after that, then the war happens, Pearl Harbor happens, and Japan, Japan, either they attack the US or they would attack the Philippines, because the Philippines was a colony of the US. So with that, they got involved again in that second war between two powers. It was Japan and the U.S.
And during that interwar period, I mean, you really see sort of so much development. As Marie noted, it's 1,000 teachers are sent over from the United States to help with the public education. There's efforts to eradicate malaria and disease. And you see this sort of in the development of Manila in a lot of ways. The architecture, the Manila Hotel, a lot of the structures there are kind of built in the image of the United States. And it creates that sort of symbiotic relationship. A lot of American businesses go there, open up shop. And at the same time, however, as a lot of Filipinos go to the U.S. during this time period.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, during that time, actually the U.S. was sending, they called them pensionados, and they would sponsor these young men who were, they had good grades in school, they were very adept, and they would send them to schools and for them to return and run the government in the Philippines. They also sent two men from the Philippine Military Academy to West Point. There were only 2 every year. But at the same time, too, they also allowed Japan, this is before the war, to send 2 of their men to West Point. So it was at the same time. You had from the Philippines and you had from Japan. At that point in time, though, those of the poor class, children of farmers, children of just storekeepers, they wanted to send their sons abroad. So for a better life, because they really had nothing in the Philippines. So some of them would sell their land or their last carabao just for that ticket to go on board a ship and go to the U.S. And of course, at that time, they were being lured by these the men who were saying, "Oh, come to the U.S. because land of gold and honey and plenty of food and good salaries and things of that sort." So they jumped ship, no visa allowed. They just jumped ship, but they would be at the lowest rank of the ship, wherein there was no ventilation, people would throw up, and it was really horrible. And that would be like about 3 weeks on board the ship. They would arrive in Canada or at Seattle, and then come down to the West Coast, San Francisco, that area. But a lot of the men were discouraged and really disappointed because they found out that the only jobs they could get was in the farms, central farms of California, picking vegetables, apples, and that central part of California was like the bread basket or the vegetable basket of the whole U.S. at that time. They had, some of them, though, were already professionals, teachers, lawyers, but they couldn't get a job because of the intense racism at that point in time. They couldn't be seen with a white woman because they would be lynched. There were signs on the restaurants that said no dogs or Filipinos allowed. So it was really a bad time for them. So with that, they couldn't get any jobs. And that happened at least in the 1920s when they boarded those ships to arrive in the US. 1920s up to the 1930s until the war broke out.
And one of those young men was your father.
Yes. 1929, he boarded the ship. He was already a teacher in Tawi-Tawi, which is the southern part of Mindanao. And again, I guess he was lured by, to increase, I guess, to enhance his knowledge and his education, so he jumped ship. Okay, so he lands, he picks apples. Then he noticed that to get ahead, this wasn't the way to do it. He had to go to the city. So he found a job in the city as a houseboy for a professor, Moore, I think her last name was, at the San Francisco State College at that time. Now it's university. And he worked there as a houseboy, learned all the Western food to cook and the way of cleaning and all that sort. And he did pretty well, I think, because I've seen pictures of him sent to conferences about the Pacific. Then, I also received, I was able to find it, and San Francisco State University sent me his 1935 transcript. So San Francisco State University, they keep those transcripts.
Clearly. Was he a good student?
Well, that's it. See, I looked at his grades and I said, I think he could have done better. I think, he could have done better because I also saw photos of him, like head of the Filipino, bachelor's club, with a cigarette in his hand and a tuxedo and so on. So I said, okay, Dad, that's what you were doing.
That's why his grades weren't very good.
Exactly. But it made me closer to him because I did not know anything about him before the war. I mean, that's it. See, I'm one of those children that they never spoke about what happened during the war. I think it was too painful for them. Or maybe I didn't give him enough time to tell me about the war because he was much older when I was born. And I remember him saying something like, we went over to here in the Japanese, and I would say, oh, later, Dad, because you're more interested in boys. You're a teenager. So I regret that. I really regret that. So.
Yeah, so the war breaks out, and of course, the good life that so many had enjoyed in Manila, particularly like the American service members who were stationed there, the business executives and all of that comes to an end when the war breaks out. And of course, so many of those young Filipino men, it's about, I think, 45,000 according to your book.
Yeah, about
that,
there.
That are in the United States at that point that are living, all of their worlds are going to collide at this point in a lot of ways. You're going to have the Death March in Bataan, but these young Filipino men, they're going to want to go. They want to go back home. Tell us about how that unfolds.
Actually, these men who went to the U.S. from the Philippines in the 20s and 30s, but they weren't young men. They were already. A lot of them were in their 30s or late 20s.
That seems young to me.
When the war breaks out. When the war breaks out, they started to join these men because they felt, maybe it was one way I could get back home. They hadn't been home in some 10, 20 years because they couldn't save enough, for a passage home. It wasn't enough what they were earning in the farms. Like, I remember 10 cents an hour or 10 cents, But then again, dance halls there were like 10 cents a dance, too. So they spent their money there and I guess the gambling and so on. And there were no Filipina women. So it was hard to create a family, which would probably keep them, stabilized in one way. But no, the gambling and then the low wages really got to them that they couldn't save enough to go back home. So by the time the war breaks out, a lot of the men joined, thousands of them, and they were already in their 30s, early 30s. The first training, they were all sent to California because that's where all the training was for these regiment, these men.
And these were Filipino units.
These were Filipino units,
yeah.
Right? The Filipino community at that time, they lobbied the President of the United States to create a special, to allow the men to fight. So what he did, the President, he created a battalion. It was called the 1st Filipino Battalion. It was a special unit because they had their own mess, so they could cook their own food, which American white soldiers would think, oh, it smells. It's very different at that time. So they had their own food, they had their own mess hall, they had their own medical company, and then their own cannon company, which was separate from the regular U.S. Army. So they had their training, they bounced around the different training camps in California. And then at that time, shall I go into the,
yeah.
Okay, shall I go to, so during that time, they're all training. And in the Philippines, what was happening was they were fighting on Bataan and Corregidor. It was a useless fight. The United States was kind of morally obligated to defend the Philippines because it was their colony. But they didn't send enough weapons, men, officers for training, and ammunitions. And there was not enough time. By the time some of these officers arrived there, a month later, Pearl Harbor happened, so they had no infantry training or anything of that sort. It was a useless battle, and I guess you know that Bataan then surrendered. General Edward King, that he was my hero. I admire him because he went against orders to fight to the death. In a way, it's like a kamikaze thing. that was kind of their orders, was to keep fighting. And they know that it was useless, but they did. They actually delayed the Japanese occupation by 3 months. So there's MacArthur in Australia, and he's defending Australia. Okay, before Bataan surrendered, MacArthur was ordered by the President of the United States to leave the Philippines, because I guess he was afraid that it would be very embarrassing if they captured him and parade him and said, oh, we've got Supreme Commander and stuff like that, or that he would die and they wouldn't have anybody to mount a campaign to go back to the Philippines on the way to Japan. But I saw the orders. MacArthur refused that first order, and he said he was going to suffer the fate of his command, and he had his wife and children with him. So I just wanted to emphasize that, because a lot of people think that MacArthur abandoned the Philippines. He did not. He was ordered out of the Philippines. So after the second order, he did, and again, to Australia. I mean, he did the PT boat, departure from Corregidor. That was really hairy and dangerous, and finally landed in the southern part of the Philippines, which is Mindanao, where there were planes from the Del Monte airfield there to bring him to Australia. And then he lands, and in Terowie, Australia, he makes that famous, it was a train. The train stops in this small place, Terowie. I looked it up. I said, well, why did he say that there? That's when he said this, I shall return. And that hit the newspapers all over the world. So MacArthur's in Australia now, and he finds out that there's no command or army for him to go back to the Philippines. So he got busy with saving Australia from the Japanese that was coming from the north. They were coming from New Guinea, and then you had the famous Kokoda Trail, and then down to Port Moresby, which is the closest to Australia. In the meantime, 2 months while he's in Australia, Bataan and Corregidor surrenders. But like I said, Bataan, with General King, he surrenders his people because he said he didn't have it in his conscience for everybody to die, probably himself too. So he decides to surrender, and I can imagine later on he was a POW in Japan, that for 2 years he had this in his mind that I'm going to get court-martialed. I just surrendered Bataan without any approval from MacArthur or Wainwright, who was the head of Corregidor and the President of the United States. So with Bataan surrendering, then Wainwright was forced to surrender Corregidor, and the Japanese commander at that time said, if you don't surrender, you want to surrender the entire Philippines, because he wanted to surrender only Luzon, because he wanted to allow his subordinates in the other islands to do what they could to keep fighting. But the Japanese commander said, no, it has to be all of the Philippines. So his words on the radio had to be all of the Philippines. But the internal part of it, and I saw the messages, he had difficulty with his commanders in the Visayas, the lower islands of the Philippines, because they didn't want to surrender. And they said, why do you have the authority? I mean, I'm not surrendering. So it was back and forth for several days until they all finally, had to surrender, and they did.
And, that sort of lays the groundwork, too, for what's going to happen next with the guerrilla campaign and stuff like that.
Yes. So everybody surrenders, and it's just, the Philippines becomes like a black hole. Nobody knows what's happening. Mm-hmm. And nobody knows what was happening in the Philippines. So MacArthur hears this, and he goes, of course, he says, how am I going to return? I don't know. What's happening? It's a black hole. Until one day, there was this faint radio signals that was trying to get to Australia, to MacArthur's headquarters. It was the radio of Colonel Guillermo Nakar, which was one of the commanding officers of the Philippine Army. I don't know if he was really with the Philippine Scouts also, but he found a radio and was able to hit Australia. The thing was, it was like a radio station in San Francisco, who then sent it over to Australia, to MacArthur. And they were all kind of not sure, because it could be Japanese, jamming it, or it could be a ruse from the Japanese signal officers. with that, the message was sort of like very short, like saying, the Filipino people are praying every day or every night for your return. That was basically it. When MacArthur reads that message, he was elated, he was ecstatic, he was happy, because now he knew that there was a resistance force in the Philippines that was there, ready to fight if he returns, when he returns, stuff like that. So with that, MacArthur sends, he has an aide, Courtney Whitney, his aide, who was formerly a lawyer in the Philippines, and one of the men he trusted. MacArthur had this thing about a lot of his aides were his former friends in the Philippines. It's like he knew, or what he felt he could trust them. So I found that a lot of these aides that he assigned to different roles. So Courtney Whitney goes, they're thinking, oh, there's this regiment of Filipinos in California that is training. They want to fight. So he goes to California, and out of this, about 7,000 men at that time had already signed up. And from that small battalion, 2 regiments came out of it. And I think in a regiment, there's like 1,500 men, and so on. So, so Whitney takes about 800 men and starts interviewing them. I saw the 3x5 cards. It's in the MacArthur Library. For each of the men they interviewed, they have the name of the men, their age, and their age, and then what they could do. You know, they could do a typewriter, or have they are they officers, or are they less than college graduate? And so all of that. And out of the 800, he chooses about 400 to go to Australia to train for these secret missions. Out of that 800, I collated them, less than 100 was under 30 years old. So all of the men were in their 30s at that time. So they're all being sent to Australia, and more training, rigorous training, physical training. But to some of the men, it was easy for them because of all the hard work that they were doing in the farms of California. So they were all, either buffed up or really, really strong. They were in their 30s. And I read that a lot of these men, they were able to outrun, outpace, outdistance a lot of the other younger recruits because of that. So, all right, so there, and then so in Australia, the training happens. MacArthur mandates that this unit was going to be top secret. I saw all the documents, and they were all stamped top secret. And they had, their camp was outside of Bow Desert, which is 50 miles, I think, from Brisbane. And it was called in the beginning as Camp X. At the latter part of the war, the name came out, which is Camp Tabragalba. There was no one who could enter it or leave it without any permission at all from the commanding officer. So all these men were there, and then finally about 1,000 of these men arrived. About 1,000 men arrived because they were not only the 450 men, but also other American signal officers who were supposed to work with the men when they go on their secret missions. So they're there, they're training, and each one of them is called. They don't know when they're going to be called. Could be today, tomorrow, or in the next 15 minutes, to form a group that would go on a submarine to they don't know where in the Philippines.
Yeah, and so, and that's going to sort of begin the genesis of a lot of this help that MacArthur is going to begin sending into the Philippines to feed this resistance movement. And it becomes a really important movement in the Philippines and sort of keeping the Japanese off balance, sort of undermining their control. And of course, later in the war, particularly by the time you work up to Luzon, the Battle of Manila, the Philippine guerrillas are going to be a very formidable force. So tell us about, how are they getting these guys? You mentioned about submarines, but tell us, how are they coming in? What are they bringing? What are they doing? How do they build up this force?
Okay, MacArthur's plan was to send a submarine to,
and you've got the map up right now.
Let's get the map up, right. Oh, I think you have the clicker?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. There it is.
Yeah.
Okay. So MacArthur sends submarines to these islands that has an arrow on it, to these islands in the Philippines. And these are, he would pick some of these men that he had trained on radio work, the most important, this radio work. And they would bring in these submarines, weapons, weapons, supplies for the guerrillas, and also the very important radio and the signalmen. Okay, so when they arrive in the island, whichever island, sometimes they don't even know which island they're going to arrive in, because the orders would be the officer of the submarine was told not to open the orders until they were already at sea. So nobody knew where they were going, and if these submarines sunk, nobody would know where these men were. Also, because they were considered secret cargo in the officers' logs, the submarine logs, just secret cargo, no names of these men. So it was quite a risk. Let me backtrack a bit. Of the 450 men, they weren't like told to go on these missions. They volunteered. And so that's where I decided my book would be dauntless, because they knew that it was a suicidal mission. They weren't coming back, and they knew that. They still wanted to go. So that's when the training started and so on. And then when a mission had to be formed, they would ask the men they would pick some men, and then they'd ask them, do you want to go on this mission? We don't know where, but this is what you're supposed to do when you get there. So, and that's when some of the men, and I show that in the book, and how they would respond to that. So the submarines would leave. The leader of the submarine mission had the objective that on the island, they were supposed to find a guerrilla leader who could unite that island. And because that would be the guerrilla leader that would send, they would send the weapons, ammunition, and supplies to. And in return, the guerrilla leader would provide a security for the mission men, maybe food, and also intelligence on the enemy. So the guerrillas would go out, find all about the location of this Japanese garrison or this Japanese unit that's in the area, and so on, and send it to the signal men who came with the submarines. They would analyze it and then encode it and then send it to Australia. So that was sort of the process. You think it's easy. It was an easy process, but no, it wasn't, because when the men arrived, if there was a guerrilla leader, they were brought to them, because they don't know. It was just the guerrillas who arrived. They would tell them, okay, our leader for this island is so-and-so. They go, and it might not be the leader of that island. There's infighting amongst the guerrillas. Okay, there were bad guerrillas and there were good guerrillas. So yeah, they were fighting for turf and men, because they were powerful at that time. There were no rules. So most of the islands that the submarines landed, they were able to find one who united their island. But there were like about a third of these islands that they did not want to submit to one. So it became even worse for these mission leaders they were the ones that coordinated to get the intelligence, because these men were fighting. They were fighting amongst themselves, so they had to coordinate that to make sure that they get all the information on the enemy to be able to code it and send it to Australia. Okay, so those men who just were not supported, that's these men on the missions, they suffered. They were on their own. They starved. They were sick with malaria and all the jungle fevers. Every time the Japanese would come near, they'd have to hide. They would burn all their documents and then run again to find another good hiding place and then set up the radio. They had to keep that radio on the air no matter what, because that was MacArthur's eyes and ears. That was his eyes and ears. And so a lot of them had to do that. Okay. So with that, you had there was a time. There was the big, Mindanao was the closest to Australia. So they received most of the, Mindanao is the lower island down there. It's closest to Australia. It's right at the tip of Darwin, and then you've got Mindanao's right up there. they received the most equipment, the most radio, and then they had to radio equipment and weapons and supplies. They had to be the distribution point to the islands that the submarines have not landed yet, you see. So the big naval transmitter was set up there for the radios, because any of the radios that was coming in from the north who couldn't reach Australia had to go through them, the big one. Also, the weather stations. The radios that would provide, weather information would pass through also that big naval transmitter. One time that naval transmitter went down because they had to hide. The Japanese was coming, they had to hide. So for maybe they were off the air for about 48 hours. So they were all running and everything. So after a while, they found a safe place. The radio went up again. I saw the messages of MacArthur. And it was not good. It was not good. He said, that radio is not supposed to go down at all. Yeah. Do you hear me? It was like repeat, repeat. And he said, because I'm blind. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's happening to you. So with that radio transmitter, it never went down until the end of the war. That special transmitter.
And you were writing too, just to give you a sense of the volume of communication coming out, it was over 14,000 messages that were sent out of the Philippines during this time period.
Yes.
Alerting MacArthur. And some of the things that they'd be doing would be like coast watching, looking for the comings and goings of Japanese ships, things of that nature. Closer towards the Battle of Manila, the guerrillas play a really formidable force, for example, in relaying the intelligence coming out of the city. And I've read some of those guerrilla messages. It's down to, at this intersection, the Japanese are fortifying it, and here's what you're going to be expected to find there. And so the guerrillas were sending messages out on the conditions, because as the war progresses, particularly in Manila, like the big urban area, conditions deteriorate, food's running out, things like that. And I'll never forget one of the messages I read said, it is cheaper to buy it's cheaper to buy a child than it is a hog in the city of Manila. And so they're sending out battlefield-related messages, troop movements, things of that nature, but also messages about what's going on culturally, society-wise, things of that nature that are providing that important intelligence that's going to be vital for MacArthur when he comes back and returns. And so I think you mentioned too is these missions, you could see on the map, it's 41 different missions, different submarine missions coming in, 20 different subs bringing it in.
Yeah.
So, and so, as this is, I think too, tell us a little bit, because bringing these forces together and sort of organizing them and getting them ready to be that formidable force by 1945, that's a pretty big struggle that takes place. Corralling everybody, organizing everybody, and getting them ready. Tell us a little bit about kind of how they build up like that.
Okay. These men were already in Australia. So they were already in Australia and they were already in the Philippines. But the regiments in California, their combat teams were sent to the Philippines together with the liberating forces. So you had the Leyte landing, and some of these regiment men from California were taken as PCOWs. So these PCOWs, what they did was they would arrive, they were assigned to a unit, a task force, who would, when they land in Leyte and Luzon, and they would be assigned to one task force in each of the islands. They'd be behind them, and they were not supposed to go into combat, so it was a very risky job. What they had to do was keep the civilians away from the advancing task forces so that they could go ahead and do their job as quickly as possible. So with the civilians, they had to take care of them, like give them the food, medicine, and at the same time also give them the tools so that they could start planting and fishing to be self-sufficient. So that was the PCOWs. They had a group, they were some of these Filipino men from the regiment on the Leyte and Luzon landing. Okay. Then you also had, when they reached the PCOWs, aside from that, there was also the counterintelligence men. They also picked them up from the Filipino regiment. And what they did was they would look for formerly officials, like the judges, the police force before the war, and they would tell them, you have to come on board and do your job now. And they would also be looking for collaborators or probable collaborators, which then they would turn over to the Commonwealth government when the Commonwealth government of the Philippines was ready to take over. So that was a job of the CIC. It was, I kind of felt for them because reading up on them, they weren't sure really what they were doing. So it was like just the seats of, what they just thought was the right thing to do, and that's what they did. And so of course then later on you have the famous war trials in Manila, for whatever the CIC had turned over as collaborators. Then, aside from that, these men, the mission men, they were also assigned. They were assigned even to look with the groups that were looking for General Yamashita up in the northern part of Luzon. They were also part of the group that went for the Cabanatuan, the famous Cabanatuan raid, and some of them went into. That was the Alamo Scouts of General Kruger of the 6th Army. Some of them were asked to join the Alamo Scouts, and they were part of the Cabanatuan raid. Then there was also the Los Baños raid. So several of them were also asked or assigned to that. So the men were kind of scattered for what they knew, the radio and also their training, and they were ahead. They were first ahead of all the other troops that were landing. Then you had, so with all the radio, like you said, there was about 14,000 messages sent to MacArthur in Australia. Actually, these messages helped in the planning of his return. And that was one thing that I realized at the end. I'm just looking for the story of what my father's unit did, but then I realized at the end that all of these messages that they sent to Australia, and MacArthur needed it because he needed it to plan his return properly. So I truly believe that with these messages and his return, I think saved lives, Filipino and American lives. Because when the landings came, Leyte, and also on these other islands, there was always 2 days, 2 days that I would find, they would send a message to the guerrillas of that area or the guerrilla leader of that area and would tell them, rise up. These were the words, rise up, which meant, go ahead now and shoot whatever, destroy any enemy that you find there. So when they started liberating some of these islands, and even Leyte and Luzon, a lot of the Japanese garrisons were already taken over by the guerrillas or destroyed by the guerrillas. So that made me realize at the end, the value of this unit. It's not just that they went in and,
Yeah, because the guerrillas play a huge role, particularly when the United States comes back. I mean, for the landings in Lingayen Gulf, the guerrillas have already, they've actually pulled all the mines out of the water and stripped them of the explosives that they can use. They've done, they actually planted a bomb inside Yamashita's headquarters, inside one of the staff offices there. The first Americans coming into Manila to liberate it are actually greeted by a Philippine guerrilla, Manuel Colacayo, who actually escorts them to liberate Santo Tomas University, where a lot of the internees. So the guerrillas are a really formidable, important force. And of course, there's no Google Earth at that time for MacArthur to look at and figure out.
Exactly.
There's no way for him to kind of zero in on that. So he really needs this stuff here. Marie, and I'd love for us to touch a little bit more on your dad's story and how you kind of investigated that, because there's this emotional connection to this. This is, as a historian looking at it, you're digging into your dad's story. Tell us more about that.
Well, I retired to the Philippines. And when you've been working for a long time, especially in California, a high-tech company that's unforgiving, you get used to this waking up with a goal or something. So I retired to the Philippines because I could speak the language. I was born there. But I spent over half of my life in California. Your first 2 years, you're fine. I could do anything I want. I love it, retirement. Then afterwards, you start saying, is this all there is to it?
Yeah.
So I had to be busy. But serendipity, by coincidence, I had a niece in Mindanao who sends me this pamphlet. And the pamphlet there says, Tita, which means aunt, you might want to read this. And I did. And in there, this Ising was a little town north of Davao City, and it told the story of the 130th Infantry Regiment guerrillas. They were so proud of liberating that junction of a big Japanese garrison. I think it was regiment of garrison, Japanese garrison there. And they had no help from the Americans, so they were proud of that on the ground. They did have aerial help later during the fight. And who leads the regiment into battle is my father. So I'm going, okay, what did this man do? So that got me going. So I go with my brother to Mindanao, and we talked to the high school professor there. I said, tell us more about it. And like he's dumbfounded, seeing you're the children, and I'm dumbfounded too. Why don't we know this? Embarrassed, embarrassed, embarrassed. So he tells the story, and I go, oh my gosh. So I go researching some more, and then I come up. At that time, there were at least 20 veterans who were still alive, and they were at that battle. So I gathered a team, tried to find funding, funding from the rich families of that area, and they provided funding so I could get the video, the radio, the video, the camera, and the laptop, so that they could go interview them in the language, that they're familiar with. Then I meet up with my father's adjutant. Now, how close can that be? He said he was there when he was shot, because my father was shot in the shin during the Battle of Ising, and he was shot in the toes. So he said, and so we're looking at each other too, and then he said to me, yeah, I was there. They lifted him up to Leyte, and then from there to the United States, where he underwent like 12 operations on that shin of his that was shattered by a machine gun fire. They told me it was a sniper, but later on I found out it was a machine gun fire. And so with that's where that book, that little small book on the Battle of Ising started, and I thought I'd do it for the people of Mindanao because, Philippine World War II history it's not something that's available in the Philippines. Actually, we don't have a Philippine World War II history books. Not much are written. There's probably 5, and it's by a guerrilla officer of the island that he was with. So I did that. So what happened? That one, in short, as the Americans were liberating Davao, that was in May of 1945. My father was leading that regiment to remove the Japanese garrison at about 36 kilometers north of Davao City to clear that road because the Japanese garrison would be stopping the liberating forces from going north. And so the rest was history. My father, though, was shot and lifted off, but they were able to remove that Japanese garrison to continue on like 2 days later, and so on.
So how do you investigate this story? You talk to people, you did archival research.
Yeah.
You spent a lot of time in the National Archives in College Park. Tell us.
Yeah, well, okay, so that story is done. I thought I was done.
Never the case.
Never the case. So Facebook, okay, whoever's on Facebook, there is a group of the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiment on Facebook, and I happened to find them. The children of these men of the regiments are all in there asking for the same questions. What did my father do? Because their father never spoke about it. So to me, it's like, oh, that's like my dad too. So that went on for a couple of years until finally I said, you know what? I've got nothing to do. I'm going to do it. So I decided to find the story of their unit, the regiment's unit. The National Archives, the radio communications between these men on the different islands with MacArthur in Australia, they're all there. The National Archives, yes, RG 406 or 407. Then at the MacArthur Library, I got the point of view of the aides of MacArthur on what they thought. And especially the aide of MacArthur, which was Whitney, because he led that group. It was called the Philippine Regional Section, to form these submarine missions. The Philippine Regional Section was really taken from, well, first of all, you had the Allied Intelligence Bureau that MacArthur created because he wanted to be separate from the OSS. But he didn't like the OSS. He said, I'll do my own thing. And because he does his own thing, he was able to do this, I think. You have to have that kind of personality. So he does, and so he has the AIB. But then at the same time, the AIB is just Pacific. area. It had the Dutch, I think, the Dutch, the British, and so on. So he said, I need these men. It's just my eyes and ears in the Philippines. So he has a Philippine regional section. With that, they coordinated. They found Charles Parsons. He had lived in Manila for a long time. Again, a friend of MacArthur, trusted. Charles Parsons was a man that MacArthur said he was the bravest man he's ever known. He said about Charles Parsons, you should read up on him.
Yeah, Chick.
Because, yeah, Chick Parsons.
Yeah.
He didn't have to do this. He had already taken his family out and ensconced them in I don't remember what, one of the states in the U.S. or the cities. But he comes back and he reports to MacArthur and he says, I want to go in the Philippines and see what we could do with the guerrillas. Now, he had lived in the Philippines for a long time, so he could speak the language.
And he went in and finagled it under a Panamanian passport.
He
said,
did.
I'm basically the consul general of the Panamanian embassy.
That's to get out with his family.
Yeah.
So he did. But coming back in, because he was a short, stocky guy, and he was really, really tanned, from all of the sun. And the thing was that he moved around without a weapon. Mm-hmm. He didn't want to bring a weapon. That's scary, I think, to me. Mm-hmm. But he was able to talk to all these various guerrillas and to convince them later on with the submarine missions who would unite the island. He would try to convince him to do that. And he did with Leyte. Mm-hmm. Or else Leyte wouldn't have had a guerrilla leader, Kang Leon, when MacArthur arrived in Leyte. And so Charles Parsons was a Navy guy. He was able to convince the Navy because the first 6 submarine missions were patrol submarines. They were smaller and they were removed from their patrols in the seas between Japan and the Philippines. So their main job was to sink enemy ships, and they were small. But at that time, they needed them so they could send some men, at least some initial radio and some supplies, but it was so small that it wasn't enough. Okay. When Whitney took over, Parsons comes in, and he convinces the Navy, we need bigger submarines. And that's when there were 2 cargo submarines that the Navy gave for these missions, the Narwhal and the Nautilus. Mm-hmm. They were able to bring like 40 tons or 100 tons of cargo and about 20, 30 men. So that was really good. And the Navy was happy with that because then their patrol submarines can go back to doing their job, which is sinking enemy submarines in the seas between Japan and the Philippines. The thing about that is that the Navy said, what's in it for me? If I bring all of these supplies and men and so on. Understood. Parsons said, because this is MacArthur's command or mandate or what, these signal men and with the radios, they're going to be all over the islands. And they will watch for enemy ships in the important seas, like the seas between Luzon and Leyte, the San Bernardino Strait, the Surigao Strait, the Leyte Gulf, and all that. They'd be watching from their places high up in the hills or wherever they were to watch these enemy ships that were coming. Then they would send it to the naval base in Perth. And in turn, Perth would send it to the submarine that's in the Philippine seas, and they would sink it. And of course, the Navy got the credit. They were happy to do that.
Absolutely.
They were happy to do that. So that's where the agreements came on board, that the whole thing sort of like went on from there. So the Navy was very helpful from that time on. Now, I wanted to say that, the earlier talks were about Kurita and Shima, the Sugar States and all that stuff. Okay. In my book, I placed there that they had to go through, because they were coming from the west, okay? Palawan Strait, one of the lower islands, there was a big Japanese naval area there. So I think Kuritas came from there, and they had to go through the islands, the central islands of the Philippines, to get to Leyte, who's on the east side. And then Shima's ships also had to go down and still go through those islands to get to the eastern side, okay, to do their fighting. But then when they did that, what I wanted to say is that a lot of these signalmen, they were already in their areas, in those islands that they had to go through, and they saw these ships passing. So they sent the messages, I'm sure, to Australia. And I put that in my book.
Absolutely.
So.
Well, why don't we open it up, Jeremy, for a few questions? I mean,
Why don't we give a round of applause to James Scott and Marie Vallejo? Thank you very much. Please raise your hands, and Connie and I will get to you. We're going to go to your right towards the front, please.
Thank you both for a great presentation, and I'd just like to ask Marie if you could speak a little bit on some of the officers in the 26th Cavalry and others that, such as Edwin Ramsey, that did not surrender and went into the jungle and ended up, well, as you know, he led 40,000 guerrillas. And he wasn't the only one. There were many others that led that many. But could you speak a little bit on that?
This was a 26th Cavalry. This was a 26th Cavalry that the last horse charge, the last charge.
Yes.
In the Philippines, right? Okay. Yeah. I think a lot of them died. Yeah. 26th Cavalry was led by Ramsey. And Ramsey escaped and became one of the guerrilla leaders on Luzon, really, especially in the Manila area, because he knew Manila. There's a couple of books written on the 26th Cavalry, but they did their last charge. It's the last cavalry charge of the U.S. It's in the Philippines. Eventually, their horses died because I think they were against some Japanese tanks at that time. That's pretty much what I know of the 26th Cavalry.
Next question is towards the back to your right, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to know what your dad did after the war and returned to California, and when did he pass away, and what do you remember about him and his service?
Yes. Where do I go? I'd like to talk about the Philippine Army. Okay, before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had already the command, which MacArthur took, and because he was already the head of the Philippine Army at that time. It was a mandate or an order, or however you want to put it, that any Philippine Army soldier who would sign up for the war would be part of the U.S. Army, and then they would get benefits afterwards, the same as the U.S. Army men. Okay, so a lot signed up, but there was again not enough time for training and weapons. I mean, some of them used bamboo spears for weapons and World War I weapons and so on. What was sad, and so they did, and they fought beside the U.S. Army regular men on Bataan Corridor. They died with them and everything. But then after the war, Truman rescinded that. So they never got those same benefits. And that hurts until now. The Philippines will not forget that. So they rescinded that. So they never got those same benefits. And a lot of them, they died together right beside their U.S. counterparts. But the men of the regiment, because they were U.S. Army, they were not affected by it. They got U.S. They got the U.S. benefits, which is, I remember my dad, he was able to buy a house with 0 down payment, via, VA loan, things of that sort. And he always went to the VA hospitals and so on. So the men of the U.S. Army, these regiment men, they were not affected. And also, I forgot, because to bear arms, you had to be an American citizen. So while they were training in California, the President of the United States mandated or had them as naturalized as U.S. citizens. So they could bear arms and fight, because you had to be a citizen to fight for America. So in a way, it's like the right to fight. You had the 442nd Japanese, And then you also had the Tuskegee men. In a way, these Filipino men were in the same boat, I would say.
So your dad's story after the war.
Yeah. Okay. Then I just wanted to say about this Rescission Act, and so that's why, because there was a lot of unfairness. Okay. So my dad, after the war, was not affected by any of these rules that the U.S. government did. There's a couple more that the U.S. rules, the U.S. awarded or something, but it was not enough. My dad, after the war, then he meets my mom. He meets my mom, and so they get married. My mom's family didn't like him, of course. That's how it goes. You see, in the Philippines at that time, there was sort of like a class thing. You're not from my island. You don't speak the same language as me. You're not from a good family. Things of that sort. That was at that time then. That's all from the I think the Spanish side. So anyway, they get married because I'm on the way, and I was born in the Philippines. I was born in the Philippines and so on. So my dad, he got a job later on, Equal Opportunity Department of the U.S. government, and they tried to have the family, but eventually they divorced, and I went to live with my dad, and that's why I have a bond with my dad. When I was a little girl, do you want me to talk about that? Mm-hmm. The little girl thingy?
Yeah. Well, I think, the gentleman's, just curious about your dad's story, so yeah.
Okay, because when I was a little girl, I was 9 years old, and, at that time, you had to take a nap in the afternoon. I didn't want to take a nap, so I went to my parents' room, and I see his briefcase. It's open. I open it, and I see some papers there, which I really don't understand as a 9-year-old, but it had something to do with, they were my dad's name, and then the names of 2 women. I burned that in my mind, and I told myself, I'm not going to tell anyone because I'll get into trouble, and also I'm going to look for these women. Why are they in a paper with my dad's name on it? So go now, 30 years, and then the internet starts to come out. I put these women's names in there, and one of the, I get this, a hit. After about a year of putting my dad's name in there, it's an email between 2 women. And one woman is saying, "Oh, Mom, I didn't know you looked in there." And I looked at the mom's email. It had Isabel, which is that name in the briefcase. I said, and it's Australian email. So I said, my dad, from California was sent to Australia. And he was there for about, I think 10 months of, only like 7 months of training before he was sent on that submarine missions to Mindanao, where he spent 10 months there also. So with that, I just kept it in my mind. I said, okay, when I go to Australia, I'll try to find out some more. All right. Then I was now 13 years old. I lived with my dad. After the divorce, I lived with my dad. I opened my dad's drawers. I'm cleaning. Again, very curious. I find this letter. It's coming from Mindanao, from a woman to my dad, and in there is a picture of a young man. And I said, he kind of looks like my dad. So you see what you could do with the internet?
Maybe you should stay off the internet.
I know. and research. So that's kind of what happened. And later on, we sort of gathered together. Eventually, we all got together, all 4 of us. We looked at each other and we said to each other, I bet our dad never figured out that we would meet one of these days. That was his secret. So,
ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for James Scott and Marie Vallejo. Thank you so much, Marie. Thanks to you both.